From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's an exciting day in Washington and here in the Kluge Center. This morning we had a delegation of congressmen come in for a really fascinating conversation about the great difficulty of doing their work. And they cited today in particular, and tonight we're going to see, I think it's likely a vote on health care with long-term ramifications. Oh, really? See, I've been doing too much academic work today. I haven't been checking the news. Well, some kind of vote is coming, because it's been proposed, and I think the nearness of our work to the work of Congress is one of the many things that makes the Kluge Center so exciting. And I'm delighted to introduce Lainey Millar today, who will explain her work in the literary interstices of the Cold War, and particularly the aspect of the Cold War that eluded most of us growing up in the United States in the 1970s, but Cuba's very deep involvement with Angola in Africa, a different kinds of transatlantic partnership, and the literary results of that Cold War alignment. There are a few Kluge scholars whose work I know in more detail than Lainey's, because I was a guinea pig for her. Instead of the other way around, I offered to do an interview with her that we put up on our website, and it was incredibly fun and interesting, and brought me back into my own complex memories as a kid in the 70s, growing up in the shadow of a Cold War whose full complexity most of us never really understood, and we're still working it out years afterwards. So she will speak to us today on literary afterlives of the Cuban and Angolan revolutions. It's from a book manuscript that she is working on entitled A Poetics of Disappointment, Cuban and Angolan Narratives After Revolution. Lainey's an assistant professor of Romance languages at the University of Oregon. She attended Baylor University as an undergraduate and received a master's at Middlebury. Her research focuses on contemporary Caribbean and African literature in Spanish and Portuguese. And before calling her to the stage, I want to remind you that Frauke Saxe is speaking on April 4th, Songs of Faith and Devotion, Discovery of the Quiche Kaplas in Kislak Manuscript 1015. And Arun Sood is speaking on the cultural memory of Robert Burns in 19th century America on April 6th at 4. Both of those talks are here in LJ 119. And on April 13th, Wayne Wiegand is speaking on the history of school librarianship. So without further, and please turn off your cell phones because this is being recorded. Without further ado, please welcome Lainey Millar. Lainey.
Thanks so much, Ted, for the introduction. I couldn't be happier to be here, and I have to start by thanking the wonderful staff of the Kluge Center, those of you who are here, the librarians in the collections that I've been able to consult here, especially Laverne Page in the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room, and thanks to the colleagues and for the many wonderful conversations that we've been able to have over the last 6 months while I've been here. So as Ted mentioned, what I'll be talking about today are parts of the research that I've been able to complete here that are drawn from chapters in my book manuscript. I'll start with an overview of the project, talking a little bit about the theoretical and historical justification, and then I'm going to discuss two novels as examples, one Cuban novel and one Angolan novel. And then a quick vocabulary note, when I use luso as a prefix, it refers to the Portuguese language. Okay. Cuba and Angola share a long history of Iberian colonization dating from the 15th century, and are also two poles of the transatlantic slave trade that continued into the 19th. More recently, they share the histories of 20th century leftist revolutions. Cuba's, of course, triumphed in 1959, while Angola won its independence from Portugal in 1975. In both places, the link between the colonial past and the threat of a neo-colonial present provided an ongoing rhetorical basis for seeing Cuba and Angola as involved in similar ideological battles that became literal ones when Cuba began to send troops to Angola in 1975. A 1976 speech by Fidel Castro commemorates the anniversaries of the Cuban victory over U.S. invaders in 1961 at Playa Girón, known in the U.S. as the Bay of Pigs, and Angola's independence from Portugal, laying out the rhetorical underpinnings of the long entangled geopolitics linking the two nations. In Girón, quote, "In Girón, African blood was spilled, that of the selfless descendants of an enslaved people. And in Africa, together with the heroic combatants of Angola, Cuban blood was also spilled. Those who one day enslaved men and sent them to America perhaps never imagined that one of those nations that received slaves would send its combatants to fight for liberty in Africa. The victory of Angola was the twin sister of the victory at Girón," end quote. Angolan and other Luso-African intellectuals shared Castro's rhetoric of placing together two moments of national revolution against colonial and neo-colonial forces as parallel events in a worldwide fight against colonialism and imperialism. 10 years prior, at the first Tricontinental Congress that took place in Havana in 1966, Bissau-Guinean revolutionary Amilcar Cabral had used almost the same language as Castro of retracing the roots of the slave trade in the shared interest of decolonization. In his speech, after lauding the accomplishments of the Cuban miracle of the early revolutionary years, he declares, quote, "We are prepared to send to Cuba as many men and women as may be needed to compensate for the departure of those who have interests or attitudes that are incompatible with the interests of the Cuban people. Taking once again the formerly hard and tragic path of our ancestors, mainly from Guinea and Angola, who were taken to Cuba as slaves, we would come now as free men to strengthen the bonds of history, blood, and culture which unite our peoples with the Cuban people," end quote. Angola was the site of Cuba's largest internationalist military and humanitarian mission. During the first 15 years of Angola's civil war, which lasted until 2002, Cuba also sponsored thousands of African students on the island and sent teachers, engineers, and doctors to Angola to fill the technical voids left when Portuguese personnel abandoned the country. Angola's politicians and intellectuals expressed their gratitude publicly, and the two writers' unions signed an agreement of mutual publication in 1976. The public rhetoric in national and international publishing venues around the South Atlantic emphasized a process of mutual self-recognition, articulated, as we see in these two speeches, through notions of Africa diasporic siblinghood, as well as through anti-imperialist solidarity. However, as much as this period produced similar works of revolutionary solidarity, there is a parallel strain in literature in both hemispheres that derails the utopian imagined futures that develops among tightening political and cultural policies, the death and mutilation of thousands of soldiers in Africa, and the increasing distance between political posturing and social disintegration as the civil war escalated in Angola. This presentation will discuss characteristics of this alternative phase of Cuban and Angolan narratives from the late 20th century, analyzing Angolan author Pepe Tella's 2001 novel Jaime Bunda, Secret Agent, and Cuban Eliseo Alberto's 1998 novel Caracol Beach, through the lens of what I'm calling a poetics of disappointment. I define disappointment as an effective and formal response to revolutionary enthusiasm. In his article titled Anatomy of Enthusiasm, Cuban historian Rafael Rojas argues that the early years of the revolution represented a spectacle of ideas in which public debates centered on the shape and future of the new utopian revolutionary era. To describe the newness of the feeling associated with this spectacle, Rojas draws on French theorist Jean-François Lyotard's 1986 essay Enthusiasm, a Kantian critique of history, in which Lyotard proposes an analogic relationship between an experience with unprecedented political events, like revolution, and the Kantian experience with the sublime. In Lyotard's analysis, enthusiasm offers a glimpse of the potential for social betterment that provokes the observers of the revolutionary event into a political commitment. While for Kant, the French Revolution serves as the foundational event in modernity that inspires this feeling, Lyotard argues that different times and social conditions will produce different events that produce widespread enthusiasm. He uses as his example May of 1968 in Europe, while Rojas offers the Cuban Revolution as another possible event. This feeling of enthusiasm for the possibility of a more radically just society produced particular types of culture on both sides of the Atlantic. Angolan and Cuban literature and film focused, for example, on revising or correcting the colonially inflected historical record, on privileging subaltern points of view, and on placing history and art making into the metaphorical and literal hands of the masses. Artistic styles were concerned with the new, with breaking past molds in order to find a new visual and verbal language, forms, and styles that would adequately reflect the new social conditions. The Cuban Revolution in the 1960s, therefore, had at least two, certainly more than two, possible intellectual narratives. One as the inheritor of the liberal tradition founded in 1789, but a second one that privileged its links to the anti-colonial struggles across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The second history is theorized thoroughly in Cuban essayist Roberto Fernández Retamar's seminal essay, Caliban, published in 1971, which Rojas reads as a pivot away from the possibilities of the liberal tradition toward an ideology of third worldism, in the essay's argument for using the figure of Shakespeare's slave in The Tempest as a symbol for Cuba's identification with and allegiance to the formerly colonized world. Cuba's turn away from the global north to embrace African and Latin American liberation movements in the late 1960s precipitates among some of its theorists a new genealogy of revolution, founded in a radically anti-colonial interpretation of the enslaved and the oppressed taking charge of their historical future. It's no accident, for example, that the Haitian Revolution and its leadership appear in literary and historical works as an alternate sign of the age of revolutions in novels and works of history. And works discussing slavery focus on acts of rebellion and resistance rather than romantic depictions of suffering. Toussaint Louverture, among other Black revolutionary historical figures like the Brazilian Zumbi dos Palmares and the Angolan queen Nzinga, appear in Angolan literature as historical predecessors and founders of a tradition of resistance. However, a series of events starting in the late 1960s and continuing into the 1970s altered the artistic and political landscape, precipitating Cuba's break with the Euro-American left. On the Cuban side, first, the series of high-profile censorship cases in the late 1960s, especially the imprisonment and forced confession of crimes against the revolution by poet Eberto Padilla in 1971, and the silencing of playwright Anton Arrufat after 1968. Second, the establishment of the Cuban Cultural Ministry to centrally regulate cultural production, initiating the period that essayist Ambrosio Fornet calls the Gray 5 Years in the early 1970s, for its top-down implementation of strict aesthetic models and the threat of ostracization, imprisonment, or censure for those who did not comply. In Angola, after the leftist MPLA party won the government in the months after independence from Portugal, the anti-colonial conflict escalated into an international conflict when South Africa invaded its southern borders, and then progressed to a full-out civil war. 1977's failed coup d'etat led by Nito Alves against then-President Agostinho Neto resulted in a series of forced confessions, persecution, and execution of presumed collaborators, and the civil conflict continued to intensify. It was accompanied by a state-sponsored publishing program similar to Cuba's, where literature proliferated, but where the political thrust of works of art were tightly monitored to be sure of compliance with the program linked to revolutionary ideals. This period, in short, ushered in the beginnings of a widespread feeling of disappointment. In my work, disappointment responds to how the radical possibilities of revolutionary promise take on recognizable political forms such as bureaucratization, censorship, and corruption, while the new literary forms that had been associated with utopian ideals and revolutionary promise become the basis for prescribed aesthetic models. Texts of disappointment revisit the radical possibilities of revolution through a poetics of citation and imitation. They use techniques such as parody, pastiche, and historical rewriting. These practices, in turn, interrogate the meaning of signs, forms, or events for which the cultural value is changing. So I'm now going to turn to the first example of a literary text of disappointment, the satirical detective novel Jaime Bunda, Secret Agent, by Angolan novelist Artur Carlos Mauricio Pestana dos Santos, better known by his pen name of Pepe Tela. Perhaps the most famed living Angolan writer, Pepe Tela's corpus spans the early years of revolutionary action in the mid-1970s to the present day. In the midst of a career of prize-winning historical novels and later works critical of corruption and domestic conflict, Pepe Tela has written two Jaime Bunda novels, Jaime Bunda, Secret Agent, published in 2001, and the follow-up Jaime Bunda and the Death of the American, published in 2003. They appear in the decade after the constitutional reforms of 1991 left behind the single-party government in favor of a capitalist multi-party democracy, in Pepe Tela's depiction turned kleptocratic autocracy in the 21st century. The protagonist of both novels is the comically inept, secret, not-so-secret agent of Angola's fictional General Investigative Service. He obtains his nickname of Bunda due to his outsized backside, which is what Bunda means in Portuguese. He holds his lowly junior position only due to the nepotism of a distant relative. While both the Jaime Bunda novels nod to the genre conventions of detective fiction, in both novels he's attempting to solve a murder, the wandering, tangled intrigue of government corruption, social disorganization, false leads, misinformation, and widespread ineptitude by the end of both novels fails to result in a satisfactory resolution for either crime. In Jaime Bunda, Secret Agent, the titular character, the laughingstock of his office, gets his big break when his boss recruits him to oversee the investigation of the rape and murder of a teenage girl. Jaime finds it strange to devote national police efforts to the case, since her family is neither politically nor socially prominent. But it is his first chance to put into practice the investigative techniques he has read about in the English language crime novels and films that he favors. He ultimately fails to discover that the murderer is the son of a prominent Congress member. That crime is solved by the local police. But he does accidentally stumble upon an international counterfeit currency ring. His discovery leads to the apprehension of several of the players, but leaves the masterminds at large. Nonetheless, Jaime, distracted from his original mission and more concerned with his esteem in his office and his access to a gun and a car, accepts his new reputation as a star, more or less willing to accede to the version of the truth that puts him and his collaborators in favor with the bosses. In the novel's portrayal of this inept but accidentally successful investigator, we can read in Pepe Tela a satire of a wide variety of aspects of contemporary Angolan society, including nepotism and his critiques of a rising revolutionary elite turned bourgeoisie in the 21st century, who, following the post-Cold War political winds, embrace all things American. Although, of course, a running joke in the novel is that Jaime can't distinguish references to British detectives like Sherlock Holmes, J.G. Reader, and James Bond from American ones like Mike Hammer, Philip Marlowe, and Perry Mason. For him, they're all gringos. However, in the connections between the way that the novel narrates Jaime's imitation of fictional detectives, I also read the novel as a literary pastiche. And here I'm drawing on Gerard Genet's definition of pastiche as a satirical form of imitation that is primarily concerned with style. Pepetela manifests the stylistic imitation central to pastiche in describing Jaime Bunda's approach to investigation, drawn from a literary history of careful observation and logical deduction clearly rooted in classics like Edgar Allan Poe and Conan Doyle. The first time we meet Jaime, we learn that while he lacks the confidence of his bosses and coworkers, he has honed his observational acumen through minute observation of the details around him. Quote, "They never gave him a chance to prove that he could be an ace, only ordering him to go and buy cigarettes. During all those months spent in that room, more than 20, he learned to distinguish all the types of flies which came in and out of the windows." End quote. Later, as Jaime is briefed on the details of the case, he interrupts his boss with the observation that his superior has one brown shoelace and one black one. The style of his speech reveals a clear allusion to the step-by-step reasoning typical of Sherlock Holmes or Auguste Dupin. Jaime Bunda got up from the chair in front of the chief's office and walked around to the other side to stand next to him. He even bent down to get a closer look and then straightened up with a triumphant smile. "This is what I think happened, Chief. Actually, both shoelaces are brown. Only one received some black polish, probably when you were shining your shoes. Did you do that yourself, Chief, with one of those bottles with a little sponge at the tip?" Jaime Bunda went back to sit comfortably in front of his superior, who could not stop looking at his shoes and then at his subordinate, completely dumbfounded, his authority undermined. End quote. The joke, of course, is not just that Jaime is forced to exercise his considerable observational skills on exaggeratedly trivial matters, but that he is entirely unable to distinguish trivial or irrelevant observations from important clues. Well, in a Sherlock Holmes story, such an episode might serve to demonstrate the detective's skill in advance of a brilliant deduction that solves the crime. Jaime Bunda equally enthusiastically pursues leads that are related to the case and others that just match patterns he has read about. "Cherchez la femme," he mysteriously repeats several times throughout the novel, quoting Alexandre Dumas, but then he never tracks down the one female character who holds the most important information. It might well be said that if the murder is largely without clues that lead us as readers to its conclusion, the novel is replete with clues like the mismatched shoelaces that are unrelated to any crime. The deliberate unpairing of the detailed narration of the protagonist's observations and reasoning from the investigation of the crime and its clues is one of the primary ways that the novel deforms the detective fiction style. After sharing his affinity for crime fiction with his inspector, denying that an Englishman was distinct from an American since they're both gringos, he urges his companion to begin with Conan Doyle, which is always where to begin, right? However, I argue that the way that Pepetela satirizes the detective style also points to another literary source that remains entirely unacknowledged in the novel. The Mystery of Sintra Road, published in 1870, is considered the first detective story written in the Portuguese language by Portugal's most famed 19th century author, Essa de Queiroz, and his friend Ramalho Ortigão. The Mystery of Sintra Road was a satirical literary hoax about the supposed accidental murder of a young Englishman by his beautiful Portuguese lover, delivered in a series of letters to the editor of the Lisbon newspaper Diário de Notícias, and this is an image of the first one. The final letter, spread over more than 2 months, in the final letter, the two authors reveal that the case is not news of a real murder at all, but a literary fiction. The key to figuring out the hoax is style. The two authors said they wrote it to make fun of a Portuguese reading public that they see as uncritical of the exaggerated and tired tropes of the sentimentalist novels that were popular in Portugal at the time, but which the two writers saw as markers of Portugal's backward tastes and lack of sophistication. The clue to figuring out the prank lies in contrasting it with the new modern style epitomized in modern French poets and writers like Edgar Allan Poe. Both modern style and sentimentalist tropes are evident when one of the main characters finds a clue to the murder, a single hair that turns out to belong to the murderer herself. Quote, "The person to whom it belonged was blonde, fair, certainly small, mignon, because the strand of hair was very fine, extremely pure. The character of this person must be sweet, humble, dedicated, and loving. She must have simple tastes, elegantly modest, the owner of this hair. She was likely educated in England or Germany because the tip of the hair was cut into a point, a habit of the women of the North completely foreign to the meridional women who abandoned their locks to their abundant natural coarseness." End quote. The narrator's careful examination of the hair results in all the stereotypes of the sentimentalist heroine. Although the narrator here is able to glean a comically excessive amount of detail from a single object, another sentimentalist trope gets in the way of satisfactorily resolving the crime. All the 5 young men determined to figure out what happened to their friend fall in love with the murderer, and thus they end up helping her get rid of the body and retire to a convent rather than face justice. These two elements, the unresolved crime and the satire of style, are what I'm calling on to link the 19th century Portuguese text with the 21st century Angolan one, especially through the notion of counterfeiting. The counterfeit news that the mystery of Sintra Street represents reappears in Jaime Bunda's Secret Agent as a false conspiracy that Jaime conceives in order to deliver some results to his bosses when he fails at solving the murder. He stages a raid on a made-up drug ring, but to his surprise, discovers in the process actual criminals who are scheming to exchange counterfeit Angolan kwanzas for US dollars. "You're a genius, Jaimito. You'll go far in the service," his partner tells him after Jaime reveals the plot. Jaime's genius in his invention of stories differs only in the details from the crime he actually discovers. The narrative structure is more or less the same. On the one hand, this conclusion certainly points to Pepetella's critique of corrupt public officials. Jaime invents a story that brings him success, but the social milieu is so replete with crimes that he ends up solving an accidental one anyway. On the other hand, however, as readers, we're called upon to recognize another kind of counterfeit, just like the readers of the 19th century novel. In explicitly attributing the sources of Jaime Bunda's style of investigation to English language sources, the Portuguese origins of the satire are obscured. I think that this mapping together of the acknowledged and unacknowledged sources are crucial to the novel. Well, for the Portuguese novel, the detective formula serves as a marker of literary modernity that guides the astute reader to figure out the hoax and tricks the uninformed reader who fails to perceive the clues. In the Angolan novel, the history of the crime genre referenced throughout the text has itself become the formulaic form and style that is ultimately insufficient, at least as deployed through Jaime Bunda's lens, to grasp the complexity of the Angolan society in which it operates. In most crime fiction, the reader is also the detective, and the economy of the text provides the necessary clues for both the detective and the reader to follow the logic. While Jaime can apply the narrative formula to his Luandan context, the intimate integration of the content and style fall apart. The layering of the two English and Portuguese sources of literary styles operates as both a critique and a warning. If the revolution sought to cast off the vestiges of colonial occupation, replacing Portuguese political hegemony with American cultural hegemony leaves the fundamental colonial formulas intact. The old and the new colonial regimes float just above and just below the surface of Angolan reality. For Pepetela and for Jaime Bunda's world, the key to the crimes remain illegible without both of them. The second example I'm going to discuss of a text that employs techniques of disappointment is Cuban novelist Eliseo Alberto's Caracol Beach. But I want to begin, however, with a discussion of an image to which I'll return at the end of the talk. And special thanks to Arud Sood for the image. This is missing there we go. Okay. Popular knowledge asserts that Fidel Castro never appeared publicly in anything other than military fatigues between 1959 and 1994, when he was famously photographed in a guayabera. His fatigues continued to be Fidel's preferred public dress until he stepped down from the presidency in 2006. In the days after his death, the state newspaper Granma ran photos of Fidel from throughout his long political life, chatting with peasants and school children, playing baseball, greeting world leaders, and speaking from podiums, all the while dressed in the military uniform that provided him visual continuity over the decades of his influence. The cover page graphic from the November 27th issue, a black and white stylized image of dozens of identical armed Fidels, emphasizes both the saturation of images of the iconic leader and communicates the idea of the soldier come everyman in the headline that accompanies the image. Cuba is Fidel. Depending on the viewer's visual, rhetorical, or political vantage point, the graphic suggests an audience which is incorporated into the multitude, replicating Fidel's march toward the future of the revolution. Or alternately, viewers faced with an army of infinitely reproducing opposing forces, perhaps even about to be overcome. The starkly divisive implications of the black and white graphic encapsulate one of the ways in which authors such as Eliseo Alberto reflect on the revolution's rhetorical inheritances, where the neat partitions of the Cuban community seem to themselves divide and multiply, producing dozens of different iterations. And we'll come back to this image. Eliseo Alberto's 1998 novel Caracol Beach explores the profound impacts of what the author sees as a Cuban community divided against itself. The Cuban Revolution's saturation of images, slogans, and language of militarization and Manichaean divides is one of the effects of a national leadership that saw itself as under constant threat or even attack by larger forces of imperialism, usually the United States, that threatened to undo the course of its history since 1959, or even to annihilate it altogether. Alberto's novel addresses the extension of the sense of threat from without through reference to two phenomena that mark the configuration of the Cuban community in the latter decades of the 20th century: the internationalist missions abroad, ostensibly extensions of revolutionary fervor and solidarity on foreign ground, and the divisions among the Cuban community, especially as imposed through exile. In Caracol Beach, the protagonist, Beto Milanés, a Cuban soldier in the Angolan War, is the sole survivor after his company is ambushed. Convinced that he has betrayed his country after he's rescued by American forces, Beto chooses 17 years of isolation and exile over facing what he is sure will be punishment back in Cuba. Beto sees suicide as the only way to rid himself of the madness that haunts him after the war, symbolized in a winged tiger that follows him around. He kidnaps 3 teenagers to assist him in his death wish, forcing 2 of them to commit increasingly violent acts against strangers, and ultimately, these 2 die with him in absurd accidents at the end of the novel. So my argument here is that this novel critiques the reproduction of violence, focusing on how media images of Cuba at war result in a system that passes real violence along a chain of actors, including the violence of a community divided between the island and exile. Beyond its critique, however, Alberto's novel also calls for a kind of truce, looking to Afro-Cuban ritual as a counterpoint to bring the many divided factions of the Cuban community toward reconciliation. Eliseo Alberto de Diego Garcia Marrús, another long name, is part of one of the most prominent intellectual families of 20th century Cuba and was an eclectic and prolific writer. He established his reputation in journalism, film, and eventually television script writing, and published chronicles, essays, poetry, and novels. He moved to Mexico in 1988, and despite many attempts to return, was only able to return to Cuba in 2010, a year before he died. The breadth of his area of production are evident particularly in his novels. In addition to a vast array of cultural reference points drawn from music, literature, and film, Caracol Beach frequently lapses into extra-diegetic commentary, that reads at times like a film voiceover, stage directions, or director's commentary on the action taking place in the background. Beyond a quirk of the individual author's range of talents and interests, however, I think that this technique points to a broader context. Alberto was a young child when the revolution triumphed and was educated and came of age during its first 2 turbulent decades. The cinematic texture of the novel thus also signals to its readers a history of the ongoing participatory construction of the revolution and its lived realities via visual representation. Critic Lilian Guerra has analyzed the revolution's construction in media via what she calls a hyper-real futurity. She focuses on television, photography, and film's portrayal of social mechanisms like mass rallies, voluntary labor, and military service. In postmodern theory and media studies, the hyper-real refers to a displacement or disappearance of external reality in favor of a reality experienced through simulation, image, and representation. Guerra explains, critical to explaining the imagery's importance to struggles over the grand narrative is the idea that images, photographic, imaginary, personal, played a central role in placing Cubans outside the mundane circumstances of their daily lives and into the hyper-reality of the revolution, that is, a utopia caught in the process of becoming. Like hyper-real spaces in any society, hyper-realities of state-orchestrated mass rallies and routinized volunteer labor projects convinced participants that the euphoria, the happiness, the sense of justice, the pride of unity, and self-righteousness that the experience generated were emblematic of reality, that is, the rest of the society external to the hyper-real experience. One authenticated the other, even though they were not the same. That authentication showed that the values of the hyper-real experience should not be contested. End quote. In Caracol Beach, the vestiges of the revolutionary hyper-reality show up most frequently in the soldier's flashbacks and memories of his experience in Angola, but lose their integration with his present reality. In the novel's present, the soldier's kidnapping of the teenagers, holding one named Laura hostage, calls up the familiar Hollywood cinematic plot convention of the woman in peril, perhaps even a direct reference, a possibility that just occurred to me a few weeks ago, to the classic 1944 noir film, Laura, who many of us saw together. However, the predominating references are to the genre of war epic, connected explicitly to the war in Angola. The surprise ambush that kills Beto's fellow soldiers is a kind of twisted, negative incarnation of the war films that Beto is trained with in advance of his deployment, specifically Soviet war propaganda. While his disillusionment and even madness caused by the loss of his companions and his homeland are foreshadowed in his frequent references to Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. While I won't have time today to analyze in detail the specific film references in the novel, I do want to examine the place of the novel of media representation of violence in general. The difference between cinematic scripting and the soldier's lived reality remains the underlying conflict for the character's experience. As he recounts in his soldier's diary, quote, "What's happening is that nothing's happening. In training back in Cuba, they showed us movies about the Great Patriotic War, and naturally the defense of Leningrad that lasted months and months was condensed into 2 hours in color with music in the background, and so the battles were exciting. But in real life, you will learn that wars are full of dead time, routine, the worst boredom. You dig trenches and fill them in, climb a tree, get water from the river, and you don't see shooting anywhere. Or you hear it like thunder in a rainstorm falling in hell, until I guess the day comes when it's your turn to get wet in the shower of lead, and others see our lightning in the distance while they're digging and filling their trenches." Poundcake says, "We really are the Seven Samurai. I'm the crazy one. Because just for a roof over our head and a few sardines, we've come to defend the future of a people we've never even heard of." End quote. Beto's epithet of the crazy one, which recurs throughout the novel, results in this case from the gaps in his comprehension between experience and image. What defies logic for him results in searching for a state of perception that accommodates simultaneously contradictory experience and representation. Guerra discusses the case of Cuban documentary filmmaker Nicolás Guillén Landrian, whose films throughout the 1960s and 1970s were repeatedly censored by the state, while the filmmaker was forcibly interned in a mental asylum. Authorities argued that his films were, quote, incoherent with the context, end quote. Here, Guerra points to a critical intersection between state power and the artist's power to create the lived reality of the audience via the hyperreal work of art. Guerra's characterization of Guillén Landrian casts the filmmaker's madness as a result of the failure of the artist to accommodate the work of art to the idealized experience of the people. Being out of coherence with the context is equivalent to being out of one's mind. Beto's madness is certainly a result of being out of context. He believes himself to be a failed revolutionary, since he survived the attack that killed his entire fellow company, and is literally out of context by living in exile in the land of the enemy, the United States. His solution, however, rather than a challenge to state power, is to restore his proper cinematic ending by scripting his own death to comply with the cinematic trope of the revolutionary soldier who sacrifices himself to the cause. He describes the scene in a letter to his rescuer, quote, "Watch for any carelessness on my part and shoot me. Bring your son. The boy will witness a wonderful scene, like in the movies. I'll fall on the sand, in slow motion, background music, a harmonica. The sand will gradually turn red with blood. Don't turn my body over. Leave me like that with my arms outstretched. A fistful of sand in my right hand. The fingers of my left hand spread open in a fan. Fabulous. Bring your son." End quote. So this is a trope. Here I just have 3 apologies for the poor quality screenshots from Cuban films roughly contemporary to Alberto's career. 2 of them, Caravana and Cangamba, are films about Angola, but this appears everywhere. You guys have all seen it. The details that the soldier mentions, the background music, the slow spreading of the blood, the position of the hands, even the perspective of the spectators, fulfill the cinematic particulars that were missing among the tedium and boredom of his dead time in real combat. They produce via simulated image the sacrifice that would allow him to comply with the projected course of the revolutionary soldier. But more importantly, however, their cinematic staging transmits that message of sacrifice to the spectators. Those spectators he has built into the zone staging of the scene. Bring your son. The ultimate danger of the kind of aestheticized and scripted violence that the soldier imagines is not just his individual suicide, but the reproducibility and then the actual reproduction of the violent scene, resulting, Alberto warns, in a kind of collective annihilation. The wartime violence also serves, crucially in the novel, as a metaphor for the reproduction of violence on the Cuban community, politically motivated divisions on the island, and of course, the fundamental violence of exile. Virtually the entire novel takes place on foreign ground, either Angola or Florida. The conflict between hyper-reality and lived experience culminate in Beto's final climactic performance, his actual death, but one that does not comply with the cinematic end that he's imagined for himself. It turns into, rather, a ritual space where the damaged, the exiled, and the mad can find release. In Beto's final act, expecting to be shot by the police officers who have come to rescue the teenagers, he discovers at the moment of his death that he is accompanied by Yemaya, the Orisha, or the saint or spirit in Cuban Santeria, who represents both maternity and waters, that substance that connects Cuba to Africa, as well as the island to its exile communities. But Yemaya is not the first Orisha that Beto invokes. Giving up on resisting his madness, he calls up Babalu Aye, the saint syncretized with the Catholic Saint Lazarus, who both causes and cures illness. The ritual practice serves here as a counterpoint to the revolution's mediatic representation. And it also recalls a prior historical moment of entangled African and Caribbean histories, the slave trade that brought these religious practices to the Caribbean. Dreaming of his return to Cuba and his promise to honor Babalu Aye if his wish is granted, Beto imagines himself as part of a procession. Quote, at a certain distance, quiet, respectful, loyal, patriotic, thousands of Cubans in solemn procession, men and women, young and old, sinners and penitents, vagabonds, lepers, the maimed, the mongoloid, the lame, the blind, the mute, the half-witted, the diabetic, the desperate, the disabled, the one-eyed, the tubercular, the deaf, the moronic, the paralytic, the handless, the tongue-tied, the weak-hearted, the hopeless, the asthmatic, the AIDS-infected, the paranoid, the solitary, the melancholic, the neurotic, the mad, mad, mad. Hundreds of the poor madmen, some incurable like him, Beto Milanés, end quote. In its repetitive rhythms and syntax, this passage performs the processions in which devotees to Babalu Aye participate each 16th of December, some of them crawling with stones tied to their ankles or otherwise simulating disease or disfigurement to honor the Orisha and ask for healing. So what I want to do here is offer this passage as a counterpoint to the image with which I began the section of infinitely replicating fidels. Rather than reproducing the model revolutionary, Alberto here is using the novel as a space to ritually acknowledge those figures whose representations fall outside of the hyper-reality of the revolution, as well as to call for bridging the divides that separate the Cuban community from itself. This, I believe, is the function of the layering together of film and other media with the form of the novel. And here, I'd like to return to that idea of disappointment. So this is my conclusion. The techniques that I've analyzed with both of these novels use citation in part as a way of insisting on the place of art, and specifically of literature, as a privileged place to negotiate both the possibilities imagined as part of revolutionary fervor and to bridge the divides between those hopes and the difficult realities that many Angolans and Cubans live in the latter decades of the 20th century. I've tried to show not only that authors from different places engage similar literary techniques, but that Cuba and Angola's mutually imbricated leftovers of enmeshed Cold War-era ideologies and post-colonial geopolitics continue to be visible through the very forms of the novels that contemporary writers produce. As I hope we've seen, the notion of disappointment certainly encompasses critique, but it does not remain solely in the realm of the negative. Techniques of disappointment also constitute, in cases especially such as the Alberto novel, an ethical re-engagement with the politics and promises associated with the early years of revolution. Considering texts like this together also reveals their similar turn to the potential of literature itself, as both an expression of the negotiations that make art a site of healing and rebuilding community. In both Cuba and Angola, the revolutions live on in literature. Thanks.
We have time for some questions, and if you wouldn't mind repeating it so it's captured.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Questions? Shannon. Yeah. Thanks so much, Shannon. So just to repeat the questions, the first one was about the critic I cited, Lillian Guerra, and her use of the image to generate a sort of mass affect, and that's relationship to Lyotard, the theorist that I cited at the beginning. And then the second question about this passage of listing all the deformities and how that might be provide a different kind of model of revolutionary collective. So thank you so much for the questions. They're both wonderful questions. I think that you are absolutely spot on in the relationship between the mediatic construction of hyperreality that Guerra describes and the possibilities that Lyotard opens with other possible ways of generating enthusiasm. Of course, Lyotard is one of the theorists of the sort of postmodern moment and the use of image, and I think that you have pointed to an excellent way in which that could be deployed to describe why his idea of revolutionary enthusiasm is different from Kant's. And so for Kant, I think it is absolutely predicated on the physical presence and participation and observation of the revolutionary action. And your question is making me think if maybe Lyotard is proposing that there's another kind of observation that's mediated that might be able to produce that kind of enthusiasm as well. And so Guerra mentions, for example, the difference between going to a mass rally when you can't really perceive the size and scale and sort of impact on the space, and then seeing it on television where you think, I was one of those, hundreds of thousands or millions of people there. And so that might be one way to begin to approach those things. And so thank you for that. I'm going to think about that further. The second question, I think you're absolutely correct as well. And so I like your suggestion of a different model of revolutionary collective. So there are a number of artists and writers who would think of themselves or whom the critics have labeled dissident, and I don't think that Eliseo Alberto is one of those. He's a member of a community that always insisted on his right and his desire to return to Cuba. And he, interestingly, had several obituaries as well as publications that came out posthumously in Cuba, which would not have happened with some earlier generations of exiles. And so I think that model of bridging various aspects of the community and not allowing exile to become a cutting off from the revolutionary action is going to be key. Yeah, thank you. Matthew and
Didn't really work.
That's a really excellent question. So just to sort of outline the question, Matthew is talking about the sort of triumphant narrative of Cuba's participation in a war that neither of the superpowers was interested in getting involved with until they were forced to, and what the Angolans might think of that. I don't have a complete answer to that question. That's one of the questions that I'm trying to answer. The official position from Angola is absolutely one of solidarity, friendship, gratitude. So in 2013, the Cuban International Book Festival was dedicated to Angola. That was their special invited country. They have a special invited country every year. And they did all of these translations of Angolan literature. Most of the translators that I talked to had served in Angola in some capacity, and that was how they knew Portuguese. And every single one of the Angolan writers who attended would start off speaking by saying, I want to express my thanks and solidarity with the Cuban people. Thank you for what you did for our country. But notably, several authors were not there. And the authors that tended not to be there, the most prominent one was the young writer Ondjaki, are authors who have, in some cases, expressed a more nuanced perception of Cuba's presence in Angola, not as a critical presence necessarily, although there's one ethnography that interviewed Angolans that calls them the good colonizers. I don't imagine that sentiment is widespread, but I don't actually know. And so the gap, sort of that gap between the official position and what people talk about among themselves is one of the questions that I don't have an answer to yet, and I really, really want to find out. Thanks. Thank you so much for that comment from an actual Kant scholar, or somebody who knows Kant better than I do, I think. I really like your sort of touching a sublime that can never last, because of course the notion of the sublime is that it can't be cognized, right? So there's a necessary search for some kind of concept or form that will allow us to discuss that, but of course the paradox is that moment is then lost by putting it into a form. So I appreciate the commentary. Yeah. And that's really helpful also because there is, of course, an extensive body of theory that looks at revolutionary theory and its connections to Catholic theology and the sort of messianic figure of the revolutionary. Thank you. Okay, Mary Lou. Yeah, that's a really, so sorry, the comment is about Shadden's work on the seduction of the colonized by the colonizer, and its relationship maybe to this relationship between two nations that see themselves as colonized people. I think that's a really excellent point, and in fact, there's a long history of theorizing, particularly in the Portuguese context, that the Portuguese were the exceptional colonizers because they seduced their colonies. They didn't conquer their colonies violently. And so I think actually part of the image of the violent revolutionary is a deliberate mechanism to counteract that ideology of seduction. So violence becomes sort of reified and celebrated as this possibility of resistance against a colonizer that did not seduce, but in fact violently conquered and oppressed the people on whom this supposed seduction is being enacted. And so I think that's an excellent sort of comparison to make about the sort of circulation of the opposition to that kind of seduction. Thank you.
All right, everyone, please join me again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.